February 19th, 1945. Dawn had not yet broken over the Pacific when Kapitanleutnant Hiroshi Tanaka stood in his concrete bunker overlooking the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. He had been a naval observer before the war, trained at the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, schooled in the traditions of Tsushima and Jutland. He understood naval gunnery. He had studied fire rates, ballistic tables, the mechanical limitations of cruiser main batteries. He thought he knew what was coming. He was wrong. Through his German-made binoculars, Tanaka watched the American fleet materialize from the pre-dawn darkness. 7 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, destroyers beyond counting, the largest naval bombardment force ever assembled in the Pacific. His notebook, discovered decades later in the ruins of his command post, contained calculations written in a steady hand. Maximum sustainable fire rate for cruiser 8-inch guns, 2 rounds per minute per barrel. Expected bombardment duration, 30 minutes of intensive fire before barrel cooling required. Total anticipated shells, perhaps 800 from the cruiser force. Then, USS Pensacola, a heavy cruiser displacing 9,000 tons, opened fire at 0500 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened next shattered every assumption Tanaka held about naval gunnery. The ship's 10 8-inch guns began firing, and they did not stop. The rhythm was impossible. The volume was incomprehensible. The mechanical sustained fire that poured from those barrels defied everything Tanaka had learned about metallurgy, propellant management, and crew endurance. By 0510, just 10 minutes into the bombardment, Pensacola had already exceeded Tanaka's 30-minute estimate. The shells kept coming. At 0515, Tanaka stopped trying to count individual impacts. The island was simply erupting in continuous explosions. His hand began shaking as he wrote in his notebook, "They are not stopping. The barrels should be glowing red. The crews should be exhausted. This is not possible." The bombardment continued for 2 full hours. When USS Pensacola finally ceased fire at 0700 hours, preparing for the amphibious assault, the ship had fired 4,045 rounds of 8-inch ammunition. 4,045 rounds in 120 minutes, 33 rounds per minute. More than 3 rounds per minute from each individual gun barrel, sustained not for minutes but for 2 solid hours. Tanaka's final notebook entry, written in increasingly unsteady characters, read simply, "American industrial capacity is beyond comprehension. We cannot win this war." The observation was correct, but it came too late. By the time Japanese observers understood what American naval gunnery could achieve, the outcome of the Pacific War had already been decided. Not on the black sands of Iwo Jima, but in the factories of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, where American industry had transformed naval warfare into something the Imperial Japanese Navy never anticipated and could never match. The story of American naval bombardment at Iwo Jima is not merely about superior firepower. It is about the collision between 19th century assumptions and 20th century industrial reality. It is about the psychological shock experienced by Japanese defenders who believed they understood naval warfare, only to discover that American manufacturing capability had redefined what naval guns could accomplish. Most significantly, it is about the moment when Japanese military professionals realized that the war they were fighting had been lost before the first shot was ever fired. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered World War II with some of the finest naval guns ever manufactured. Japanese 8-inch cruiser guns, mounted on ships like Takao and Maya, were marvels of precision engineering. They fired 200-pound shells to ranges exceeding 30,000 yards. Japanese optical rangefinders were superb, perhaps the best in the world. Japanese gunnery officers trained for years, mastering ballistic calculations that Western navies simplified with mechanical computers. But Japanese doctrine, like German artillery doctrine in Europe, emphasized precision over volume. The philosophy traced back to the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, when Admiral Togo's fleet had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet through superior accuracy and crew discipline. Japanese naval doctrine ever since had worshipped at the altar of precise, deliberate fire. Every shot was to be carefully aimed. Every salvo was to be properly spotted. Rate of fire was secondary to hitting the target. This doctrine made sense in fleet engagements, where cruisers and battleships maneuvered against each other at long range. In that environment, the ship that scored the first critical hit often won the engagement. Speed of fire mattered less than accuracy of fire. But shore bombardment was different. Shore targets did not maneuver. They could not return effective fire against ships standing offshore. The tactical equation shifted entirely toward volume. The side that could put more shells on target, regardless of individual accuracy, would suppress defensive positions more effectively. The Americans understood this. The Japanese did not, or at least did not understand the degree to which American industrial capacity could exploit this advantage. Japanese cruiser doctrine called for sustainable fire rates of 1 to 2 rounds per minute per gun. This aligned with international norms. British cruisers achieved similar rates. German cruisers, before their defeat, had matched these standards. Every navy operated under the same basic constraints: gun barrel heat, crew fatigue, ammunition supply, mechanical stress on breech mechanisms. American heavy cruisers in 1941 operated under these same constraints. The early model 8-inch guns mounted on ships like Pensacola and Salt Lake City could sustain perhaps 2 rounds per minute, maybe 3 in short bursts. But American doctrine already emphasized sustained fire over precision, and American industry was about to remove the constraints that limited everyone else. The transformation began in 1942, as American shipyards worked frantically to replace losses from Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns. Naval gun production became a priority second only to aircraft manufacturing. The Bureau of Ordnance initiated programs to improve fire rates without sacrificing reliability. 3 parallel efforts addressed different aspects of the problem. First, metallurgical improvements. American steel manufacturers, working with naval research facilities, developed new alloys that could withstand higher operating temperatures. The gun barrels produced in 1943 and 44 used chrome molybdenum steel with precise heat treatment. These barrels could fire longer before requiring cooling. They maintained accuracy through extended firing sequences. They simply lasted longer under conditions that would have destroyed earlier weapons. Second, propellant chemistry. American powder manufacturers refined propellants that burned cleaner and cooler. Reduced copper fouling meant less barrel cleaning between fire missions. Consistent chamber pressures meant more predictable ballistics. The powder charges used at Iwo Jima in 1945 burned at lower temperatures than 1941 charges, while delivering identical muzzle velocity. The guns could fire longer before heat became critical. Third, automated shell handling. This was the revolution that Japanese observers could not have predicted. American cruisers built or refitted after 1942 incorporated shell hoists and ammunition feeds that reduced crew handling time. The Mark 15 8-inch gun, which equipped most American heavy cruisers by 1944, included power rammers that automatically loaded shells into the breech. Crews no longer manhandled 200-pound projectiles into position. Mechanical systems did the heavy lifting. These 3 improvements combined to produce a weapon system that operated on fundamentally different parameters than anything afloat. Where Japanese cruisers could sustain 1 to 2 rounds per minute per gun, American cruisers by 1944 could sustain 3 to 4 rounds per minute. And they could maintain this rate not for 10 or 20 minutes, but for hours. USS Pensacola, designated CA-24, was an early heavy cruiser commissioned in February 1930. She displaced 9,100 tons at standard load and mounted 10 8-inch guns in 2 triple turrets and 2 twin turrets. By 1945 standards, she was elderly. Her design dated to the Washington Naval Treaty limitations of the 1920s. She had survived Pearl Harbor only because she was at sea during the attack, and she had spent the next 3 years in continuous Pacific operations. But Pensacola had been refitted twice, once in 1943 and again in 1944. Her original Mark 9 8-inch guns had been replaced with Mark 15 guns during the 44 refit. Her ammunition hoists had been upgraded. Her fire control systems had been modernized with the latest analog computers. By February 1945, Pensacola was not the ship that had entered the war. She was a floating testament to American industrial capacity, rebuilt and upgraded until she could perform at levels her original designers never imagined. The Iwo Jima operation, codenamed Operation Detachment, required unprecedented fire support. The island was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and sand, fortified over 10 months with the most extensive defensive network Japan had ever constructed. 21,000 Japanese troops occupied 11 miles of tunnels, concrete, bunkers, artillery emplacements, and defensive positions designed to survive anything short of direct hits. American planners knew that suppressing these defenses would require fire volume beyond anything previously attempted. The preliminary bombardment plan called for 3 days of naval gunfire before the amphibious assault. This was extended to 4 days, then modified to include 2 full days of sustained bombardment immediately prior to the landing. On February 16th, the bombardment force arrived off Iwo Jima. Battleships began ranging fire on pre-planned targets. By February 19th, D-Day, every ship in the bombardment force had identified specific target areas. Fire missions had been calculated. Ammunition had been brought up from magazines. Crews had been briefed. USS Pensacola drew assignment to Target Area 7, the northern section of beaches designated green and red. Her mission: suppress Japanese defensive positions along the beach terraces and inland ridges. Duration: continuous fire from 0500 hours until the first landing craft touched down at 0900 hours. 4 solid hours of sustained bombardment. Captain Richard Dale McCool, commanding Pensacola, understood what his ship was being asked to do. 4 hours of maximum rate fire would stress his guns beyond anything they had experienced in previous operations. But the Marines assaulting those beaches needed every defensive position suppressed. McCool ordered his gun crews to prepare for sustained fire at maximum capable rate. Ammunition handlers positioned shells for continuous feed. Fire control crews programmed target coordinates into the Mark 34 director. At 0455, Pensacola came to bombardment course, 8,000 yards offshore. At 0500 precisely, turrets 1 and 2 opened fire. The first salvo, 6 rounds from 6 guns, was away within 3 seconds. The fire control director spotted the fall of shot, made minor corrections, and ordered fire for effect. What happened next astonished even American observers aboard the ship. The gun crews, drilled endlessly during the transit from Ulithi, fell into a rhythm that seemed impossible to sustain. Load, ram, fire. Load, ram, fire. The power rammers slammed shells into breaches with mechanical precision. The automatic breech blocks opened and closed without human intervention. Shell hoists delivered ammunition from the magazine's 4 decks below in continuous streams. Turret 1, with its 3 guns, fired every 20 seconds. 3 shells downrange, then 20 seconds while the guns elevated, recoiled, and reloaded. Turret 2 matched the rhythm. Turret 3, the aft triple turret, joined the fire mission at 0505. Turrets 4 and 5, the twin-gun mounts, added their fire at 0510, all 10 guns firing in coordinated rotation. 30 shells per minute, 180 shells per 6-minute fire mission before shifting to new targets. Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, the ship's gunnery officer, maintained a detailed log throughout the bombardment. His notes, preserved in naval archives, document the evolution of the fire mission with technical precision. 0500 to 0515, area saturation of Beach Red 1. Expended 450 rounds. observed multiple secondary explosions indicating ammunition stores hit. No mechanical failures. Barrels hot but within tolerance. 0515 to 0530. Shift fire to inland ridge positions. Expended 420 rounds. Observed concrete bunker destruction. Turret 2 reports minor extraction issue, resolved immediately. Continue fire. 0530 to 0600. Systematic destruction of beach terrace defences. Expended 900 rounds. Fire control reports excellent target coverage. All turrets operating normally. Barrel temperatures elevated but stable. Crews maintaining rhythm. The pattern continued. Every 15 minutes, new target areas. Every 6-minute firing sequence, roughly 180 rounds. The mathematical precision was relentless. By 0600, 1 hour into the bombardment, Pensacola had fired more than 2,000 rounds. The gun barrels glowed visibly in the dim morning light. The crews were rotating through rest periods, but the guns never stopped firing. Japanese observers on the island watched in stunned disbelief. Commander Inoue Samaji, an artillery officer commanding coastal defense positions, later testified during post-war interrogations about the psychological impact. "We had prepared for bombardment. We had survived American naval gunfire at Saipan and Guam. We understood American firepower. But this was different. The shells never stopped coming. We would see flashes from a cruiser offshore, and we knew we had perhaps 30 seconds before impact. But the flashes never stopped. One salvo, then another, continuous, unending. We tried to return fire. Our coastal guns had ranges sufficient to hit the American ships. But every time we prepared to fire, another salvo would land. Our gun crews could not serve their pieces. Men attempting to load shells were killed by fragments. Gun positions that survived one salvo were hit again 30 seconds later. We stopped trying to fight back. We simply tried to survive. The Japanese had planned their defense around the assumption that American bombardment, while heavy, would be finite. Ships would fire for 20 or 30 minutes, then cease fire to cool barrels and resupply ammunition. During these pauses, Japanese crews would emerge from bunkers, man their weapons, and prepare to engage the landing craft. But the pauses never came. American cruisers fired continuously, shifting between targets, but never stopping. At 0700 hours, 2 hours into the bombardment, Pensacola's gun barrels had fired more than 3,000 rounds. The barrels were beyond hot. They were operating at temperatures that should have caused catastrophic failures. Japanese metallurgists examining captured American equipment after the war would calculate that the sustained fire temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. At these temperatures, ordinary steel loses structural integrity. Barrels droop, rifling degrades, accuracy collapses, but Pensacola's guns kept firing. The chrome molybdenum alloy barrels, precisely heat-treated and stress-relieved during manufacture, maintained their integrity. The rifling showed wear, but remained functional. Accuracy, measured by fall of shot relative to aim point, degraded only marginally. The guns were performing exactly as American metallurgists had predicted they would, under conditions that would have destroyed any Japanese or European naval gun. Commander Morrison's log notes the technical status at 0700. All turrets operational. Barrel wear within predicted parameters. Fire control systems functioning normally. Crews. Fatigued but maintaining drill standards. Ammunition supply adequate for continued operations. Recommend continue fire. Captain McCool, observing from the bridge, could see the results of his ship's fire. The target areas assigned to Pensacola were being systematically demolished. Concrete bunkers that had taken months to construct were reduced to rubble. Artillery positions were silent, beach defences were shattered, and his ship was still firing. At 0730 hours, with 30 minutes remaining before the assault waves hit the beach, McCool ordered a shift to final pre-assault targets. The gun crews, now into their third hour of sustained fire, maintained their rhythm. Turrets traversed to new coordinates. Fire control computed new ballistic solutions. The shells kept falling. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese defenders in the northern sectors were beyond shock. They were experiencing something approaching paralysis. Corporal Yamada Kenji, a machine gunner positioned to enfilade Beach Red 1, survived the bombardment by sheltering in a cave that collapsed partially during the shelling. His testimony, recorded by American intelligence officers after his capture 3 weeks later, describes the mental state of Japanese defenders. We could not think. We could not plan. We could only crouch in our holes and wait for death. Some men went mad. They ran from their positions screaming, only to be killed by the next salvo. Others sat motionless, staring at nothing, even when shells landed nearby. We had been told we were defending sacred ground. We had been told our positions were impregnable. But no position could withstand this. The bombardment was not warfare. It was annihilation. At 0800 hours, Pensacola had been firing continuously for 3 hours. The ship had expended more than 3,500 rounds. The crews were exhausted. The gun barrels were glowing. The shell hoists were running constantly, and the bombardment continued. The ammunition supply, chain aboard Pensacola, was performing as designed, but barely. Each 8-inch shell weighed 260 pounds. Each powder charge added another 50 pounds. Moving this weight from magazines 4 decks below up to the gun turrets required continuous human effort supplemented by mechanical hoists. The ammunition crews worked in rotating shifts, but even with rotation, the physical demands were enormous. Seaman First Class Robert Morrison, part of Turret 1's ammunition handling crew, later described the experience in a letter to his family. We formed human chains, passing shells from the hoist to the turret. Each shell was heavy enough that 2 men were needed to maneuver it. We worked in 5-minute rotations because no one could sustain the pace longer. The heat was terrible. We were below the waterline, but the ambient temperature was over 100 degrees from the guns firing directly above us. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and were dragged aside while replacements stepped in. We could not stop. The Marines were counting on us. By 0830 hours, 90 minutes before the first landing craft touched down, Pensacola had fired nearly 4,000 rounds. The ship's magazines, loaded to capacity before the operation, were half empty. The barrel temperatures had stabilized at their maximum sustainable level. The crews were functioning on training and determination, and still the guns fired. At 0845, with the assault waves forming up for their run to the beach, the fire mission changed. Instead of area bombardment, Pensacola shifted to precision fire on specific targets identified by spotter aircraft. These targets, bunkers, and gun positions that had survived the area bombardment required more careful aim. The rate of fire dropped slightly as fire control calculated exact coordinates for each target. But even at reduced rate, the volume remained extraordinary. Between 0845 and 0900, Pensacola fired 145 rounds at 14 separate targets. Spotter aircraft reported 13 targets destroyed or heavily damaged. The 14th target, a concrete bunker buried under 30 feet of volcanic rock, survived, but its gun ports were blocked by debris. At 0900 hours precisely, as the first wave of landing craft touched down on the beaches, Pensacola ceased fire. The final count, 4,045 rounds fired in 120 minutes. The gun barrels were too hot to touch. The crews were near collapse. The ship's magazines had been depleted to 30% capacity, but the mission was complete. The Marines who landed on those beaches found many of the defensive positions destroyed or suppressed. Japanese return fire, while still deadly, was far less intense than it would have been without the bombardment. The initial casualties were heavy, but they would have been catastrophic without the naval gunfire support. Captain McCool's decision to push his guns and crews to their absolute limits had saved lives. But Pensacola was not unique. Every cruiser in the bombardment force had performed similarly. USS Salt Lake City had fired 3,800 rounds. USS Indianapolis had fired 3,200. The light cruisers, with smaller 6-inch guns, had fired even more rounds per ship. Battleships with their larger 16-inch and 14-inch guns had fired fewer rounds, but with far greater destructive effect per shell. The total naval bombardment tonnage delivered against Iwo Jima in the 4 days before the assault exceeded 24,000 tons. On D-Day alone, more than 14,000 tons of shells fell on 8 square miles of island. No defensive position ever constructed had been subjected to this level of sustained fire. Japanese commanders attempting to coordinate the defense found their communications destroyed, their observation posts demolished, their reinforcement routes blocked. Tactical coherence of the defense degraded from organized resistance to isolated pockets fighting independently. This was exactly what American planners had intended. But the true impact went beyond tactical effects. The Japanese defenders, from General Kuribayashi commanding the garrison down to individual riflemen, had experienced something that shattered their understanding of warfare. They had been taught that Japanese spirit and determination could overcome material disadvantages. They had been told that American forces, while numerous and well-equipped, lacked the fighting spirit of Japanese soldiers. They had been assured that defensive positions properly constructed could withstand any bombardment. None of this was true. The bombardment demonstrated not just American material superiority, but the complete futility of Japanese defensive doctrine against an enemy who could deliver this level of firepower. Japanese survivors testified after the war that the bombardment, even more than the subsequent ground combat, convinced them that Japan could not win the war. Lieutenant Tanaka, the naval observer whose notebook opened this account, survived the bombardment by sheltering in one of the deepest bunkers on the island. He emerged 3 hours after the Marines landed to find his observation post destroyed, his communications equipment shattered, and his carefully prepared defensive plans rendered irrelevant. His final notebook entries, written in the weeks before his death in combat on March 7th, reveal a man who had lost faith not in his own courage, but in the entire strategic premise of Japanese resistance. We were told to hold this island for as long as possible. We were told every day we delayed the Americans was valuable to the homeland. But what we experienced here was not warfare as we understood it. The Americans possess industrial capacity beyond our ability to counter. They can manufacture ships, guns, and ammunition in quantities that make mockery of our preparations. We built concrete bunkers for 10 months. They destroyed them in 4 hours of bombardment. We positioned coastal guns to sink their ships. Their ships fired from ranges where our guns could not effectively respond, and even when we did fire, their volume of return fire silenced us immediately. I am a professional naval officer. I have studied naval warfare for 15 years. I believed I understood the capabilities and limitations of naval guns. I was wrong. The Americans have transcended the limitations we all assumed were fixed. Their ships fire 3 times faster than physics should allow. Their ammunition supply is effectively infinite. Their crews sustain rates of fire that should break human endurance. This is not superior training or superior courage. This is industrial warfare at a scale we never imagined. Japan entered this war believing that spirit could overcome material disadvantage. That belief is false. We are losing not because our soldiers lack courage, but because we are fighting an enemy who has weaponized industrial production. Every shell that falls on this island represents a factory in America, workers in America, resources that America has in abundance and we lack. We cannot win this war. We could never have won this war. That truth is written in every crater on this island. Tanaka's analysis was accurate but irrelevant. By February 1945, Japan's strategic defeat was inevitable, regardless of what individual officers understood. But his observations highlight the profound psychological shock that American naval bombardment inflicted on Japanese military professionals who thought they understood modern warfare. The technological achievement that Pensacola and her sister ships represented was the culmination of 4 years of intensive American industrial effort. The guns that fired 4,000 rounds in 2 hours were not miracle weapons. They were the product of systematic engineering improvements, metallurgical research, automated manufacturing, and rigorous testing. Every component had been refined to eliminate bottlenecks and improve performance. The chrome-molybdenum steel barrels were manufactured by forging companies that had refined their processes through thousands of production runs. The propellant charges were produced by chemical plants that had optimized their formulations through continuous testing. The fire control computers were built by companies that had miniaturized mechanical calculators to fit inside naval turrets. The ammunition hoists were designed by engineers who had studied every second of loading time and eliminated unnecessary motions. This was American industrial warfare, the systematic application of engineering principles, quality control, and mass production to create weapons that performed reliably at levels previously thought impossible. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was the result of mobilizing an entire industrial economy toward a single objective. The Japanese had no equivalent capability. Japanese industry in 1945 was crippled by American submarine warfare, strategic bombing, and resource shortages. Even if Japanese engineers had understood what improvements were needed, Japanese factories lacked the capacity to implement them. Japanese steel production could barely maintain existing equipment. Japanese chemical plants struggled to produce adequate propellant. Japanese manufacturing was focused on basic production, not continuous improvement. The gap between American and Japanese industrial capacity had existed since before the war, but it took the sustained bombardment at Iwo Jima to make that gap visible in a form that could not be rationalized or explained away. 4,000 shells in 2 hours was not a minor quantitative advantage. It was qualitative superiority so extreme that it changed the nature of warfare itself. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. American casualties were severe: 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded. Nearly every Japanese defender died fighting. The island was secured at terrible cost. But without the naval bombardment that preceded and supported the assault, American casualties would have been far higher. Every study conducted after the battle concluded that naval gunfire support, despite its limitations in destroying deeply buried positions, was essential to the operation's success. More significantly, the Iwo Jima bombardment established a template for future operations. Okinawa, planned as the next step toward the Japanese home islands, received even heavier preliminary bombardment. The proposed invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945, included bombardment plans that would have exceeded Iwo Jima by an order of magnitude. American naval doctrine had fully embraced the principle that overwhelming fire support could reduce casualties and shorten operations. The atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 prevented the Kyushu invasion, but the planning documents reveal American intentions. Every major Japanese city within range of naval guns was to be bombarded continuously. Every defensive position was to be subjected to systematic destruction before ground forces advanced. The American military had learned that when you possessed overwhelming firepower superiority, the correct doctrine was to use it without restraint. Japanese military professionals studying their defeat after the war universally identified American firepower as the decisive advantage. Admiral Ugaki Matome, commander of 5th Air Fleet, wrote in his diary shortly before his death in August 1945. "We understood that America possessed numerical superiority. We did not understand that they had transformed numerical superiority into qualitative superiority through industrial methods. Their ships fire faster, their aircraft carry more, their factories produce more reliably. We cannot match this. No amount of fighting spirit can compensate for the material gap." The post-war analysis conducted by both American and Japanese researchers confirmed these conclusions. American naval gunfire at Iwo Jima had delivered more explosive tonnage than the entire Japanese Navy could have fired if every ship had expended its complete magazine. The disparity was so extreme that comparisons became meaningless, but numbers alone do not convey the human experience. For the American sailors who served those guns for 4 hours straight, the bombardment was an exercise in endurance and discipline. For the Marines who landed under the cover of that bombardment, it was salvation. For the Japanese defenders who survived it, the experience was transformative, destroying not just their defensive positions, but their belief in the possibility of victory. Petty Officer Nakamura Ichiro, captured on March 10th after 3 weeks of isolated resistance, told his interrogators, "After the bombardment, we knew we would die, not might die, would die. The question was only whether we would die quickly under naval gunfire or slowly during the ground fighting. Some men chose to die attacking. Others chose to hide until death found them. But no one believed we would survive. The bombardment had taken our hope. The psychological dimension of American naval firepower extended beyond individual morale. It affected Japanese strategic thinking at the highest levels." General Kuribayashi, in his final messages to Tokyo before communications were severed, reported that American naval bombardment exceeded all predictions. He requested that future defensive plans account for fire support levels that he had previously considered impossible. Tokyo responded that his estimates must be exaggerated, that no fleet could sustain such fire rates. Kuribayashi's reply was blunt. "I am reporting what I am observing. If Tokyo cannot believe these reports, then Tokyo does not understand the enemy we face." The disconnect between Japanese expectations and American capabilities persisted until the war's end. Japanese planners preparing homeland defense in summer 1945 still underestimated American fire support by factors of 3 to 5. They assumed American bombardment would be heavy but finite. They planned defenses around the assumption that after initial bombardment, there would be lulls that Japanese forces could exploit. They were wrong. American doctrine and capability would have delivered continuous, overwhelming fire support until Japanese resistance collapsed. The technological lessons from Iwo Jima informed post-war naval development worldwide. Sustained rate of fire became a critical performance metric for all naval guns. Automated loading systems became standard. Fire control integration improved. By the 1950s, American cruisers were achieving even higher sustained fire rates than Pensacola had managed in 1945. But the deeper lesson was strategic. Industrial capacity, when properly organized and directed, could create military capabilities that transcended tactical skill or individual courage. The United States in World War II demonstrated that a nation with sufficient industrial resources could manufacture military superiority across every dimension of warfare. Ships that fired faster, aircraft that carried more, factories that produced more reliably, logistics that delivered continuously. Japan had entered the war believing that spiritual factors could overcome material disadvantages. The bombardment at Iwo Jima, delivered by a single cruiser firing 4,000 rounds in 2 hours, proved that belief false. American industrial warfare had created capabilities that Japanese courage and determination could not counter, could not match, and could not survive. USS Pensacola survived the war, received credit for 5 battle stars, and was decommissioned in 1946. The ship was sold for scrap in 1959. The men who served her guns at Iwo Jima dispersed back to civilian life, carrying with them the memory of 4 hours when they had fired continuously at maximum rate, until their barrels glowed and their arms ached, and the island 8,000 yards away was transformed into a landscape of craters and debris. For them, the bombardment was duty performed under difficult conditions. For the Marines they supported, it was covering fire that saved lives. For the Japanese defenders, it was revelation and horror combined. The moment when theoretical understanding of American industrial capacity became visceral, immediate, and overwhelming. Kapitanleutnant Tanaka's final notebook entry, written the night before his death, stands as epitaph both for his own beliefs and for the strategic assumptions that had led Japan into war. I have been a naval officer for 15 years. I have studied the great battles, Trafalgar, Tsushima, Jutland. I thought I understood naval warfare. Today I watched a single American cruiser fire more shells in 2 hours than I believed possible. I watched carefully prepared defences destroyed through sheer volume of fire. I watched men who had trained for months, who had built positions for months, who believed they were ready, reduced to helpless targets. This is not the warfare I studied. This is something new, something industrial, something we cannot match. If I survive this battle, I will spend whatever life remains trying to understand how we miscalculated so badly. But I will not survive. No one here will survive. The Americans have brought a level of force that makes survival impossible. He was correct. The bombardment at Iwo Jima was not merely a tactical evolution in naval gunfire support. It was a demonstration that American industrial capacity, when fully mobilized and properly directed, could create military capabilities that rendered conventional defensive measures obsolete. 4,000 rounds in 2 hours from a single ship was not just firepower. It was the sound of the future, the industrial future, arriving on a Pacific island in the form of shells that never stopped falling. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.